The last thing Rourke Calder saw before the Kestrel's deck went dark was a spread of pirate fire blooming across his aft shields like fireworks over a city that didn't want to celebrate anything. 3 raiders. Fast, ugly little interceptors with the Vandal skull's crest scorched onto their hulls, the kind of ships built by people who cared more about menace than maintenance. They'd caught him hauling a load of pre-collapse alloy out of the Dresk belt, alone, unescorted, exactly the kind of easy mark that made salvage pilots into cautionary tales. It had started, as these things always did, with a voice on an open channel that sounded almost friendly. Cut engines, salvager. Nobody needs to bleed today. Rourke had heard versions of that line a dozen times in 11 years of hauling scrap through contested space, and he'd learned the hard way that agreeing to it never actually stopped anyone from bleeding. So he'd done what he always did, throttled hard, cut a punishing burn across the belt's debris field, and prayed the Kestrel was faster than whatever the skulls had scraped together that week. She wasn't. Not by enough. The first hit took out his port side shield generator in a shower of sparks that filled the cockpit with the acrid stink of burning insulation. The second clipped his main thruster housing, sent the whole ship into a spin. He fought for 11 straight seconds before he wrestled her level again, alarms screaming in 3 languages, his own heartbeat louder than all of them combined. He'd fought. He wasn't proud of how well. By the time he punched the last working thruster and staggered the Kestrel into a blind hyperlane jump, half his hull plating had peeled away like burnt skin and his reactor was screaming warnings in 3 languages. The jump spat him out somewhere he didn't recognize, gravity well tugging him down toward a moon the color of dried blood, and then there was no more flying, only falling, and then there was no more falling, only the bone-deep shudder of a crash landing that by all rights should have killed him. It didn't. That fact surprised him more than anything else that had happened that day. Rourke came to with his cheek pressed against a cracked viewport, and his ears ringing loud enough to drown out the reactor's death rattle. Outside, rust-colored dust drifted in slow, lazy spirals under a sky the color of an old wound. And stretching to every horizon he could see through the shattered canopy, ships. Hundreds of them. Thousands, maybe. Skeletal hulls half buried in red sand, engine cowlings picked clean, cockpits gaping open like sockets missing their eyes. A graveyard the size of a continent. He sat there a long moment, waiting to see if he was actually going to survive the next 5 minutes. When his lungs kept working and the hull kept holding pressure, he allowed himself to feel something other than animal terror. Mostly it was despair. No beacon. The impact had shredded his long-range array along with everything else. No fuel to speak of, and even if he'd had it, the reactor core was cracked, which meant no engines, which meant he was stranded on a moon that didn't appear on any chart he'd ever flown, surrounded by the corpses of 10,000 other ships that had, presumably, ended up here the same way he had. He ran the numbers anyway, because running the numbers was the only thing that kept his hands from shaking. Rations for maybe 2 weeks if he stretched them. Water reclamation still functional, barely. No working comms, no working engines, no working anything that might get him off this rock before the rations ran out. He'd flown into worse odds before. Everyone who survived long enough in the salvage trade had a story about the time the math should have killed them, but he'd never flown into worse odds entirely alone, with no crew to split the fear between. "Well," he said to the empty cockpit, voice cracking with dust and smoke. "Guess I found somewhere to die." He didn't mean it. Not really. But it felt true enough in the moment that saying it out loud didn't feel like tempting fate so much as acknowledging the obvious. It took him 2 hours to get the airlock working manually, hauling the frozen mechanism open one hand crank turn at a time until the seal finally hissed and the door groaned aside. The air outside was thin but breathable, tasted like ozone and rust and something sweeter underneath, some mineral note he couldn't place. He stood in the wreck of his ship's threshold and looked out at the endless field of dead vessels and felt, for the first time in a long time, genuinely, thoroughly lost. That was when he saw the light. Small. Steady. Not the flicker of fire or the pulse of an emergency beacon, but the warm, even glow of a working lamp, coming from somewhere deep in the guts of an ancient freighter half a click from where the Kestrel had gouged its landing scar into the dust. A freighter so old its hull design didn't match anything in his ship recognition database. All sweeping curves and strange geometric paneling that looked more grown than built. Someone was alive out here. Someone had power. Rourke checked the charge on his sidearm, found it embarrassingly low, and started walking anyway, because the only other option was sitting in a dying ship and waiting for the cold to finish what the pirates had started. The walk took the better part of an hour, picking a careful path between rusted hull sections and drifts of debris that the wind had sculpted into strange, sharp-edged dunes. Up close, the graveyard was even stranger than it had looked from the Kestrel's viewport. Ships from eras he didn't recognize, hull designs that predated the earliest human colonial vessels by what looked like centuries, some of them so thoroughly stripped of anything valuable that they'd been reduced to bare ribcages of scorched alloy. Whoever had been salvaging this place, they'd been at it a long time, and they'd been thorough. More than once he heard something shift in the dark spaces between wrecks. The settle of old metal, probably, or the wind finding a new gap to whistle through, and each time his hand found the grip of his sidearm out of pure animal instinct, even though some quieter part of him already suspected the low charge in that weapon wouldn't matter much if this place turned out to hold anything worse than ghosts. The freighter's hull, when he reached it, rose above him like the ribcage of some impossible beast, plates flaking rust orange, viewports long since shattered and boarded over from the inside. But there, low near what had once been a cargo bay, someone had cut a proper door into the wreck, clean edges, a working seal, a strip of warm light bleeding out from underneath. He knocked. It felt absurd, knocking on the side of a derelict starship in the middle of a graveyard nobody sane would visit, but some habits didn't care about context. The door slid open with a hydraulic hiss that sounded far too well maintained for its surroundings, and Rourke found himself staring down the barrel of a plasma cutter, held with the kind of steady, unhurried grip that told him whoever was holding it had used it on more than metal. She was a Vulpine. He'd seen holos of her kind before. Traders talked about them sometimes, in low voices, the way people talked about anything rare and half-mythical, but he never stood in front of one. For the deep burnt orange of the moon's own dust, a white blaze running from her muzzle up between sharp, alert ears, eyes a shade of gold so pale they seemed lit from within. She wore a mechanic's coveralls stained black at the cuffs with decades of engine grease, sleeves rolled to reveal forearms corded with lean, working muscle. Her tail, long and full, flicked once behind her, sharp and assessing, like she was still deciding whether he was worth the trouble of a clean kill. "You're bleeding on my doorstep," she said. Her voice was low, clipped, edged with a wariness that had clearly been earned the hard way. Rourke looked down. He was, in fact, bleeding, a shallow gash along his forearm he hadn't noticed until she pointed it out. "Sorry," he said, which was a stupid thing to say to someone holding a plasma cutter at his throat, but it was the only thing that came out. She studied him for a long moment, not his face, he realized, but the whole of him, the same way a buyer studied a piece of salvage before deciding whether it was worth the metal it was made of. Whatever she saw must have tipped some invisible scale, because the cutter lowered, though it didn't fully power down. "Pirates," she said. It wasn't a question. "I felt your crash 3 hours ago. Surprised you're still breathing." "Me too, honestly." Something flickered at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, more the ghost of one, quickly suppressed. "Come in before the night cycle hits. It gets cold enough out here to crack bone." "You get a lot of company out here?" he asked, following her through the doorway, doing his best not to look like a man cataloging every possible exit. "None that stays." She said it without turning around, and something in the flatness of it made him decide not to ask what she meant by that. "The ones who make it this far usually want something from me. Fuel. Parts. A ride out. I give them what I can spare and send them on their way before they start thinking they're owed more than that." "And the ones who don't make it this far?" She glanced back at him then, gold eyes unreadable in the low light. The graveyard keeps them. It's good at that. Better than it is at anything else. It wasn't reassuring. He decided not to say so. Her workshop was, against every expectation the wreck's exterior had set, a marvel. The freighter's old cargo hold had been converted into something between a forge and a cathedral. Towering shelves of salvaged components organized with an obsessive precision, hand-built fabrication rigs humming with soft blue light, a forest of tools hanging from magnetic racks that gleamed like they'd been polished that morning. In the center of it all sat a half-finished engine assembly unlike anything Rourke had ever seen, its housing etched with fine spiraling lines that seemed to catch the light and hold it. "You did all this," he said, unable to keep the awe out of his voice. "Alone?" "There's no one else." She said it flatly, in the tone of someone reciting a fact so old it had stopped hurting to say, or had simply learned to sound like it had. "Sit. I'll look at that arm before it gets infected, and then you're going to tell me what's left of whatever you flew in here." He sat. She worked with quick, economical movements, cleaning the gash with something that stung sharply and then faded to a cool numbness, wrapping it with practiced efficiency. Up close, he could see the small details, the faint white scarring along one of her knuckles, the way her ears swiveled independently, tracking sounds he couldn't hear, alert even here, even now, in what was ostensibly her own home. "Rourke," he offered, when the silence stretched too long. "Calder. Salvage pilot. Was anyway. Not sure what I am now that my ship's a coffin." She didn't offer her name in return. Just tied off the bandage and sat back on her heels, gold eyes narrowed in thought. "How bad is the damage?" "Reactor cores cracked. Half my hull plating peeled off on entry. Long-range arrays slag. I don't even know where I am, let alone how I'd call for a tow." "You're on Kesserth's reach," she said. "Everyone who ends up here calls it the graveyard. It doesn't appear on corporate star charts. It's not supposed to." A pause. "You're not the first person to crash land in my front yard, Rourke Calder. You're the first one I've decided not to let die out there, though." "Small mercies. I appreciate the mercy. Don't. Yet." She rose, moved to one of her benches, began sorting through components with the same unhurried focus she'd shown when deciding whether to shoot him. "I haven't decided if I'm fixing your ship or just your arm." Her name, he learned over the following days, dragged out of her in small, grudging pieces the way water comes from stone, was Solveig Ashemark, though she told him only Vulpines used family names like weapons and strangers didn't earn the right to them easily, so he could simply call her Soul, if he insisted on calling her anything at all. "Soul," he repeated, testing it. "Suits you. Everything out here runs on solar cells, and you're the only warm thing in this entire graveyard." She'd given him a look that suggested she found the comment either charming or deeply irritating, and possibly both at once, and gone back to work without comment. The Kestrel's debt was, by any reasonable engineer's estimate, dead. Soul walked the wreck with Rourke on the second day, running practiced hands over the cracked reactor housing, the shredded hull plating, the mangled thruster assembly, and delivered her verdict without softening it. "This ship isn't flying again. Not with parts you can buy anywhere within 100 light-years." Rourke's stomach dropped somewhere down around his boots. "So that's it, then. I'm stuck." "I didn't say that." She crouched beside the cracked reactor core, tracing a claw along the fracture line with an intensity that reminded him, oddly, of a surgeon studying a wound. "I said you can't fix it with parts you can buy. I have parts nobody can buy. Not anymore." Her ears flattened briefly, some old memory passing behind her eyes before she shook it off. "It'll take work. Weeks, maybe. And you'll do your share of it. I'm not running a charity." "Weeks," he echoed. Then, because some idiot instinct wouldn't let a silence sit unfilled, "I can live with weeks. Better than living with never." That earned him the ghost smile again, there and gone before he could be sure he'd seen it. The days settled into a rhythm that surprised him with how quickly it became comfortable. Mornings, if the words still meant anything under a sky with no true sun, just the ambient red glow of the gas giant the moon orbited, started with Sol running diagnostics on the cracked reactor while Rourke stripped the Kestrel's ruined hull plating for scrap, hauling it back to the workshop in loads that left his arms shaking and his lungs burning in the thin air. She never thanked him for the labor, but she started leaving a share of whatever she cooked, some dense, nutrient-rich paste flavored with spices he didn't recognize, waiting for him on the workbench when he came back each evening, and he decided that counted for something. He learned things about her in fragments. That she'd built the fabrication rig herself, from scratch, over what must have been years, because no factory in known space could print the alloys the old freighter systems required. That she talked to the ship sometimes, low murmured words in a language he didn't understand, and stopped abruptly whenever she noticed him listening. That her hands, for all their scarring, moved with a precision that bordered on the artistic, whole components taking shape under her fingers like she was coaxing them into existence rather than building them. "Where'd you learn to do this?" he asked one evening, watching her fabricate a replacement conduit housing out of raw alloy stock, the metal flowing and reshaping under a tool he couldn't identify. "My mother." The answer came quick, reflexive, before something shuddered behind her eyes, and she added, "A long time ago." He didn't push. He learned, in the space of a week, that Sol's past was a door she kept locked, and that trying the handle only made her retreat further behind it. So instead he asked about the engine, the strange, spiral-etched assembly that sat at the heart of her workshop, clearly unfinished, clearly important, clearly not anything she'd built for a stranger's benefit. "What's that one for?" Her hands stilled, just for a moment. "Nothing that concerns you." "Fair enough." He held up both hands, a gesture of surrender, and went back to stripping wire harnesses in silence. But he noticed, after that, the way she'd sometimes stop what she was doing and simply look at the unfinished engine, gold eyes distant, tail wrapped tight around her own legs like she was holding herself together. He noticed, too, that she never worked on it while he was in the room. 3 weeks in, they hit the first real breakthrough, a working reactor core, patched together from the Kestrel's cracked housing and 3 separate salvage units Sol had dragged out of wrecks half buried in the red dust, fused into something that powered up on the 4th attempt with a low, steady hum that felt, to Rourke's exhausted ears, like the sweetest sound he'd ever heard. "You did it," he said, staring at the readout in disbelief. "You actually did it." "We did it," she corrected, and something in the way she said it, easy, unthinking, like the correction cost her nothing, made his chest tighten in a way he didn't have a name for yet. She caught herself a half-second later, ears flicking back, like she'd surprised herself with the admission. But she didn't take it back. That night, for the first time, she sat with him outside the workshop instead of retreating alone into the freighter's depths, the two of them perched on a stripped hull plate watching the gas giant's bruised light shift across the endless field of dead ships. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked. "All this," he gestured at the graveyard stretching to every horizon. "It's not exactly a life." Her tail curled tighter around her legs. "I think about it every day." "Then why don't you?" She was quiet long enough that he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice had dropped into something quieter, rawer than he'd heard from her yet. "Because out there, someone's still looking for what's left of my people. And out here, they think there's nothing left to find." He wanted to ask more. Everything in him wanted to ask more. But the way her voice had cracked on the word people told him this wasn't a door that opened with pushing, so he let the silence hold, and after a moment, surprising them both, she leaned, just slightly, just enough that her shoulder rested against his, and let it hold too. The graveyard moon had weather, it turned out, though nothing about it resembled weather Rourke understood. Sol called it a dust squall, a pressure front that rolled in off the gas giant's magnetosphere every few weeks, turning the thin atmosphere into a churning wall of rust-red static that could strip paint from a hull and, if you were caught in the open when it hit, strip considerably more from a person. He learned this the hard way. For weeks into the repair work, hauling a load of stripped hull plating back from a wreck half a click out when the sky went from bruised red to black in the space of about 90 seconds. "Rourke!" Sol's voice crackled through the short-range comm she'd rigged for him, sharper than he'd ever heard it. "Squall's coming in fast. You need to be inside in 4 minutes, or you're not getting inside at all." "I'm on it." He wasn't on it fast enough. The storm caught him 200 meters short of the workshop door, visibility collapsing to nothing, static charge crackling along every exposed surface of his suit with a sensation like 1,000 tiny insects, the wind screaming loud enough to drown out his own comm. He lost his footing on a drift of loose debris, went down hard against a scrap of jagged hull plating, and felt more than heard the hiss of his suit's outer layer tearing. He didn't remember the last 100 meters clearly. What he remembered was Sol's shape appearing out of the red static like something conjured, one arm hooking under his own, dragging him bodily through the workshop door with a strength that seemed impossible for someone her size, the seal hissing shut behind them a half-second before the full force of the squall slammed into the hull with a sound like the whole freighter groaning in pain. "You absolute idiot," she said, voice shaking with something that wasn't quite anger, kneeling over him as she cut away the torn section of his suit to check the skin beneath. "I told you 4 minutes. I miscounted. You miscounted." She pressed something cool and stinging against the gash along his ribs where the hull plating had caught him, hands quick and clinical even as her voice stayed unsteady. "Do you understand what happens to a person caught outside in a full squall? The static alone can stop a heart. I've buried 3 people who miscounted, Rourke." He went quiet at that, watching her work, noticing for the first time how her hands weren't quite as steady as she wanted them to be, how her ears stayed flattened long after the immediate danger had passed. It occurred to him, lying there on the workshop floor with his ribs on fire and the storm howling outside, that she'd been more frightened for him than she was willing to admit. "Hey!" He caught her wrist gently when she reached for the medical kit a second time. "I'm okay. You got to me in time. This time." Her voice cracked just slightly before she mastered it. "You don't get to do that again. I mean it. Sol. I mean it, Rourke." And there it was, finally, the thing underneath the anger, not irritation at his carelessness, but plain, unguarded fear, the kind that only showed itself in people who'd already lost more than their share. "I've spent 6 years making sure I never had to watch anyone else disappear into this graveyard. I'm not starting again with you." The admission hung between them, larger than either of them seemed prepared for. Rourke didn't push it further. He simply reached up, careful of his own ribs, and pulled her down against his good side, and after a moment of visible hesitation, she let him, the two of them lying together on the workshop floor while the squall raged outside and the freighter's old hull groaned around them like a lullaby neither of them had asked for but both of them, in that moment, badly needed. They stayed like that until the storm passed. Hours later, neither of them saying much, and something had shifted between them by the time the wind finally died, some careful distance quietly, permanently closed. The work accelerated after that night, in ways Rourke didn't fully understand until much later. Sol stopped hesitating over certain components, stopped hiding certain fabrication runs, started letting him watch as she built replacement thruster housings that hummed with a strange resonance unlike any propulsion tech he'd ever encountered. "This isn't standard alloy," he said one afternoon, turning a finished housing over in his hands, feeling a faint vibration in the metal even powered down. "This isn't standard anything." "No," she agreed, and offered nothing further, though the look she gave him held something he couldn't quite read. Calculation, maybe, or the early edges of a decision she hadn't made yet. Somewhere in those final weeks, the work stopped feeling like survival and started feeling like something else entirely. Rourke found himself lingering over tasks he could have finished twice as fast, just to stretch out the hours spent within arm's reach of her. He learned the particular sound she made when a fabrication run went perfectly, a low, satisfied hum, almost a purr, that she'd deny making if he ever pointed it out. She learned, in turn, that he talked to himself when he was nervous, muttering half-finished sentences under his breath while he worked, and had started answering him back just to watch him startle. One evening she caught him staring at the strange constellations visible through a gap in the freighter's ruined hull. Patterns that meant nothing to a man who'd only ever navigated by NAV computer. But that clearly meant something to her, the way her gaze traced them with old, practiced familiarity. "My mother used to name the bright ones," she said unprompted, settling beside him on the crate he'd claimed as a makeshift bench. "Said every star deserved to be somebody's, even out here. Which one's yours?" She pointed, without hesitation, to a faint reddish point low on the horizon. "That one's not really a star. It's the light off Kesrith's own rings, bent through the dust. But I decided a long time ago it counted anyway. Told myself it was watching over me, some nights, when I needed to believe something was." He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing, and simply sat with her until the light faded, and understood that being trusted with a piece of her private mythology was worth more than any thank yous she could have offered him instead. 6 weeks after the crash, the Kestrel's dead, rebuilt, rechristened in Rourke's head a dozen times, though he never settled on a new name, patched with salvaged plating that gave her hull a strange, mottled, beautiful ugliness, powered up fully for the first time. Every readout Sol ran came back clean. Better than clean. The ship that emerged from 6 weeks of joint labor was, by every metric that mattered, faster and tougher than the one that had crashed here. "She's ready," Sol said, running one last diagnostic sweep, her voice carrying a strange weight he didn't understand yet. "You can leave whenever you want." Rourke stood in the cargo bay that had become, somewhere in the last 6 weeks, less a stranger's workshop and more the only place in the galaxy that felt like it had a claim on him, and found the words "thank you" sitting strange and insufficient in his mouth. "I don't know how to repay this," he said instead. "Any of it. You don't." She didn't look at him, busy, too busy, he'd realized later, checking readouts that didn't need checking. That's not how this works. He should have left it there. Should have thanked her properly, promised to send word if he ever found his way to civilized space, and walked up the boarding ramp alone. Instead, some instinct he couldn't name made him ask, "What will you do? After I'm gone?" Her hands stilled on the console. "The same thing I always do. Alone. I've had 6 years of practice." 6 years? The number landed heavier than he expected, and something in her voice when she said it, flat, worn smooth by repetition, the sound of a wound that had scarred over but never quite healed, made him stop reaching for the boarding ramp entirely. "So, go, Rourke." She still wasn't looking at him. "Before I changed my mind about letting you." He went. He climbed the ramp, settled into the newly rebuilt cockpit, ran through the pre-flight checks with hands that felt strangely unsteady for a man about to do the thing he'd wanted for 6 long weeks. Get off this rust-colored rock and back into open space. He powered the engines. They caught clean, humming with that same strange resonance he'd felt in her fabricated housings, a sound like something ancient waking up after a long sleep. He was 30 seconds from lifting off when the boarding ramp, which he was certain he'd sealed, hissed open behind him. Sol climbed aboard without a word, a single duffel bag slung over one shoulder, everything she owned, apparently, compressed into a space smaller than his own travel pack, and dropped into the co-pilot's seat like she'd sat there 1,000 times before. She pulled the harness across her chest, clicked it into place with brisk, business-like efficiency, and finally looked at him. "I'm coming with you." Rourke stared at her, hands frozen over the flight controls. "What?" "You heard me. Sol, this is your home. 6 years, you said? You can't just—" "It was never my home." Her voice was quiet, but there was iron underneath it, the sound of a decision made long before he'd asked. "It was my prison. I only just realized I've had the key the whole time." She told him the rest as the Kestrel's debt climbed out of Kesrith's reach's thin atmosphere, the graveyard moon shrinking beneath them into a rust-colored smear against the void, and by the time the story ended, Rourke understood why her hands had shaken, just slightly, every time they'd worked near that unfinished spiral-etched engine. Her people, The Ashenmark line, one branch of a wider Vulpine colony that had settled a cluster of worlds beyond the Threnody expanse 2 centuries past, had cracked something no one else in known space had managed, a faster-than-light drive that didn't ride the established hyperlanes at all, but cut clean through the barrier separating charted space from whatever lay beyond it. A drive built on principles her people had spent 6 generations refining, grown from technology so old it predated most of humanity's spacefaring era. The corporations found out. Corporations always found out. The Syndrome Combine, Sol said, and the name came out of her like something bitter she'd been holding on her tongue for 6 years, finally allowed to spit it free. They sent Enders first. Very polite. Very reasonable. They wanted the drive specifications, said they'd pay any price, offered us protection, resources, whatever we asked. My mother refused. She said the drive wasn't a product. It was a promise. A way home, if home ever needed finding again, for people who'd already lost too much to corporations exactly like them. And when she refused, they came back with warships instead of envoys. Sol's voice didn't waver, but her tail had wound so tight around her legs it looked painful. It took them 11 hours to erase 4 generations. I was the only one who made it to an escape pod. I don't know why. I've had 6 years to wonder, and I still don't know why. Rourke didn't have words for the sound that had wanted to come out of him when she said 11 hours. He reached over instead, found her hand where it gripped the armrest white-knuckled, and held it, saying nothing, because nothing he could say would be enough, and he understood, somehow, that being present mattered more than being eloquent. The engine you were building, he said eventually, in the workshop, isn't finished. Wasn't finished before I gave up on ever needing it. A ghost of something that might have been a laugh, entirely without humor. I told myself I kept working on it out of habit. Grief, maybe. My mother's last project, and I couldn't let it die with everything else. She turned to look at him, gold eyes steady despite everything. But I brought the core housing with me. And the original blueprints. I didn't tell you that part. Sol. I hid them in your ship's aft compartment 3 days ago. I don't know why I did it before you'd even decided to ask me to come. Her jaw tightened. Maybe I already knew I wasn't staying. Maybe I've known for weeks and I was too much of a coward to admit it until you gave me an excuse. Rourke opened his mouth to answer, and that was the exact moment every alarm on the Kestrel's deck began screaming at once. Contact, Sol said, already moving, fingers flying across the auxiliary console with the same fluid precision she'd brought to everything mechanical. Multiple contacts. Hyperlane emergence, bearing 310. Rourke's hands found the controls on pure reflex, years of salvage pilot instinct kicking in even as his stomach dropped through the floor. Through the forward viewport, space rippled and tore, and 4 black warships bled into existence against the stars. Sleek, matte-hulled, unmarked except for a single insignia stamped along each prow that made Sol go utterly, deathly still beside him. A spiral, etched in silver. The Syndrome Combine. They found me, she breathed, and for the first time since he'd met her, Rourke heard something in her voice he hadn't expected from a woman who'd survived 6 years alone in a graveyard moon armed with nothing but a plasma cutter and sheer stubbornness. He heard fear. How? He demanded, already throwing the Kestrel into a hard evasive burn, red warning lights blooming across every panel as the newly rebuilt engine strained to answer. You said this place doesn't appear on any chart. It doesn't. They're not tracking the moon. Her eyes were fixed on the sensor readout, and her voice, when it came again, was flat with the particular horror of someone realizing their own mistake in real time. They're tracking the engine. I ran a full diagnostic on the core assembly 2 days ago. Powered it, just for a moment, just to see if it's still. She cut herself off, jaw tight. It sent out a resonance signature. The kind only a drive built on Ashenmark principles produces. There's only one place in the galaxy that signature could have come from. You're saying I'm flying a ship with a beacon strapped to it that says come and get me to the people who murdered your family. I'm saying I just made you the second most wanted person in known space. Her ears were flat against her skull, tail lashing once, sharp with self-directed fury. I'm sorry, Rourke. I should have told you before I brought it aboard. There wasn't time for an argument about blame, not with 4 black warships already arcing into pursuit formation, weapons ports cycling open along their prows like eyes narrowing on prey. Rourke gritted his teeth, threw every ounce of the Kestrel's newly rebuilt power into her thrusters, and aimed her nose at the nearest asteroid field visible on the NAV display, a dense, chaotic scatter of debris that gave a small, fast, well-piloted ship exactly the kind of chaos it needed to disappear into. Hold on, he said. This is about to get ugly. I've survived worse than ugly. Not in this seat you haven't. The Kestrel's deck screamed into the asteroid field with warning klaxons blaring and the black warships closing fast behind her, tracer fire lancing past the cockpit close enough that Rourke could see the heat shimmer of each near miss distorting the stars beyond the canopy. He threw the ship into a punishing roll between 2 tumbling slabs of rock, felt the hull groan in protest, heard Sol's sharp intake of breath beside him as a shard of debris no larger than a fist clipped their port side sensor array, and sent it spinning off into the dark. They're gaining, Sol said, voice tight but controlled, already rerouting auxiliary power to the aft shields with quick, sure movements. Combined cruisers don't usually carry this kind of speed. They've upgraded something. Wonderful. Glad to know we rate the good hardware. He wrenched the Kestrel through a gap between 2 colliding fragments that he was fairly certain no sane pilot would have attempted, felt his stomach lurch as the ship's newly rebuilt frame absorbed a stress load that would have shredded her old plating, and allowed himself half a second of grim satisfaction at how well she held together. Your fabrication work is the only reason we're not dead yet, by the way. Compliments later. Fly now. He flew. Minutes stretched into something that felt like hours, the Kestrel weaving deeper into the asteroid field's chaotic heart, warning klaxons never quite falling silent, until finally, gradually, the black warship's pursuit fire began to thin, their bulkier hulls unable to match the salvage ship's tight, reckless maneuvering through debris dense enough to shred anything less nimble. By the time Rourke finally throttled back, easing the Kestrel into the shadow of a hollowed-out asteroid twice the size of the old freighter workshop, his hands were shaking too hard to trust on the controls, and Sol's knuckles had gone white around the edge of her seat. Whatever quiet, careful life Rourke Calder and Solveig Ashenmark had spent 6 weeks building in a rust-colored graveyard was, in the space of those brutal 10 minutes, replaced entirely by the raw animal math of survival. And neither of them, catching their breath in the dark hollow of a drifting rock, needed to say out loud that there was no version of this life left that didn't include running, together, for as long as it took. They lost the warships, barely, at the cost of 2 thruster housings. Sol swore under her breath about the entire time she was replacing them, in a debris field 12 hours and 1 grueling hyperlane jump away from Kesritha's reach. But losing a pursuit and losing an enemy weren't the same thing, and both of them knew it. The Combine doesn't stop, Sol said 3 days later, elbow deep in an access panel while Rourke ran supply calculations at the NAV console. The two of them settled into an uneasy rhythm of survival that mirrored, in its own strange way, the rhythm they'd built in the workshop. They didn't stop for 6 years. They won't stop now. Then we need a plan bigger than run and hope. She straightened, wiping grease from her hands with a rag that had seen better decades, and looked at him with an expression he was starting to recognize, the look she wore when she was about to say something that scared her more than the black warships had. There might be somewhere to run to. He waited. Before the massacre, my mother spoke of a second colony. A contingency, in case the first was ever found. She never told me where. Only that the coordinates existed, encoded somewhere only Ashenmark blood could unlock. Sol's hand drifted unconsciously to a small pendant at her throat that Rourke had noticed but never asked about, an old, worn piece of alloy, etched with the same spiraling pattern as the engine housing. I always assumed it was a story. Something told to frighten children to make the dark feel less permanent. But now, Now I have the blueprints for a drive that can cross the barrier into unexplored space, a ship strong enough to carry it, and absolutely nothing left to lose by finding out if the story was true. She met his eyes, steady despite the tremor he could still see in her hands. It's a gamble. It could be nothing. It could get us both killed faster than the Combine ever would. Or it's the only place in the galaxy they'll never think to look, because as far as anyone in charted space knows, it doesn't exist. A pause. I want to try, Rourke. But I won't drag you into this without asking. It's not your fight. He thought about the 6 weeks in the workshop. The way she'd corrected herself, we did it, without seeming to notice. The warmth of her shoulder against his, watching the gas giant's light shift over an endless field of the dead. The particular, terrible loneliness in her voice when she'd said I've had 6 years of practice. It became my fight the day you climbed into that co-pilot's seat, he said. Where do we start? The first real test of their new life together came at a rusting transit hub called Threadneedle Station, a way station stitched together from 3 decommissioned freighters and a lot of desperate engineering, hanging in orbit around a dead brown dwarf at the edge of the Varan reaches. They'd come for parts and information, a fabrication coil Sol needed to keep the drive housing stable, and word, if any could be found, of where a second Ashenmark colony might have hidden itself 2 centuries ago. They found both. They also found trouble, in the form of a bounty hunter named Casimir Vry, a broad-shouldered man with a combined contract chip visible at his collar and an expression that suggested he'd recognized Sol's face from a briefing packet the moment she walked into the station's cramped trade concourse. Ashenmark, he said low, stepping into their path near the docking ring with 2 armed companions flanking him. Didn't think I'd get this lucky twice in one contract cycle. Rourke's hand drifted toward his sidearm on pure reflex, but Sol's fingers closed over his wrist first, a silent, deliberate warning. We don't want trouble, she said, voice even, though he could feel the tension humming through her grip. Funny. Trouble's usually what finds you. Vry's smile didn't reach his eyes. Combine's offering enough for your safe delivery that I could retire on it. No hard feelings, understand. Just business. Then let me make you a counteroffer. Sol's tail had gone rigid, every line of her body coiled tight, but her voice stayed level, almost conversational, and Rourke recognized, with something between alarm and admiration, the exact tone she'd used on him the first night they'd met, when she'd held a plasma cutter to his throat and made him feel like the negotiation was already over before it started. You take that contract ship back to whoever issued it, and you tell them the Ashenmark line was smart enough to survive 6 years alone in a graveyard nobody could find. Ask yourself what that means for the 2 men standing behind you if this goes badly. It was a bluff, mostly. They had no backup, no reinforcements, nothing but a repaired salvage ship 2 docking rings away and each other. But Vry hesitated, weighing something in his own calculations that Rourke couldn't see, and in that half-second of hesitation, Rourke made his own decision. He stepped half in front of Sol, not enough to look like a threat, just enough to make himself the more immediate problem. She's not wrong about one thing, he said. You catch us, you've still got to get us off this station alive, past whatever security actually cares about a body count in their concourse. That math gets expensive fast. Vry's eyes flicked between them, recalculating. Bounty hunters, Rourke had learned over a decade of salvage work, were rarely interested in dying for a payday, no matter how large. After a long, taut moment, Vry's smile thinned into something more like professional irritation than actual menace. Contracts not exclusive, he said, stepping back, hands raised in mock surrender. I imagine someone else'll take the risk if I don't. But I'll pass on your regards to the Combine, Ashenmark. I'm sure they'll be thrilled to hear you send them. They didn't breathe easy until they were back aboard the Kestrel, engines spooling up, the docking clamps releasing with a shudder that felt, in the moment, like the sweetest sound in the galaxy. It was only once they'd cleared the station's traffic lanes and jumped clear of the system entirely that Sol allowed herself to shake, hands trembling against the console in a way she'd been too disciplined to show in front of Vry. That was too close, she said. You were incredible back there. He meant it. He'd watched her stare down an armed bounty hunter with nothing but nerve and a well-placed bluff, and something about the sheer, reckless competence of it had left him a little breathless. Terrifying. But incredible. I was scared, Rourke. If he'd called the bluff. He didn't. He could have. Her voice cracked, and this time she didn't try to master it. I keep thinking about what happens if it's not a bluff next time. If I get you killed chasing a story my mother might have told a frightened child just to give her something to believe in. He crossed the cockpit and knelt in front of her chair, taking both her hands in his, steadying their tremor with his own. Then we get smarter. More careful. We don't stop. He held her gaze unflinching. I didn't climb into this ship with you because I thought it'd be safe, Sol. I climbed in because the alternative was letting you walk back into that workshop alone, and I'd already decided I wasn't willing to do that. Bounty hunters and combined warships don't change that math for me. They just make me more sure of it. She studied him for a long moment, something fierce and grateful and frightened all at once moving behind her golden eyes, and then she leaned forward and kissed him. Not the careful, testing kiss of two people still learning each other's edges, but something deeper, more certain, the kiss of someone who had just watched the person she loved choose her, deliberately, in the face of very real danger, and needed him to know exactly what that meant to her. Okay, she said, when they finally broke apart, breathless, foreheads still pressed together. Okay. Smarter and more careful. But we don't stop. We don't stop. Piecing together her mother's contingency took weeks. Weeks spent hopping between backwater stations and forgotten trade routes, always one jump ahead of combined patrols that seemed to have eyes everywhere, always watching the sensors for that telltale black hole silhouette. They funded this search with salvage work, Sol's fabrication skill proving as valuable a currency as any coin, quietly building a reputation in certain circles as the mechanic who could fix anything, no questions asked, so long as you didn't ask her real name. Rourke watched her change, in those weeks. Watched the wary, closed-off woman who'd held a plasma cutter to his throat slowly give way to someone who laughed, rarely, but genuinely, usually at his expense. Who teased him about his terrible piloting instincts, who sat pressed against his side during quiet nights in the cockpit without either of them quite acknowledging what the gesture meant. You're staring, she said one evening, not looking up from the pendant she was examining under a magnifier, trying for the 100th time to coax loose whatever data was locked inside its spiraling engravings. I'm thinking. About how 6 weeks ago you were deciding whether or not to shoot me, and now you fall asleep on my shoulder during hyperlane transits. She flicked an ear at him, unbothered, though a faint flush colored the fur along her cheeks. Don't get used to it. Too late. The pendant finally yielded its secret on a night neither of them expected. Rourke jolted awake by Sol's sudden, sharp intake of breath, finding her hunched over the workbench with the pendant's inner mechanism split open, a thread of golden light unspooling from it into the air, resolving slowly into a set of coordinates and a short, looping message in a language he didn't recognize but that made Sol's whole body go rigid with disbelief. It's real, she whispered. Rourke, it's real. She wasn't lying. There's a colony. The coordinates pointed somewhere the Kestrel's NAV computer refused to even acknowledge as valid space, a location so far beyond the edge of charted territory that the ship's systems simply returned an error where a star system designation should have been. That's not on any map, Rourke said slowly. It's not supposed to be. Sol was already moving, pulling the engine housing from its storage crate, hands steady now with purpose instead of grief. We're going to need the drive fully assembled to get there. And once we activate it, really activate it, not just a diagnostic pulse. She looked up at him, gold eyes bright with something that was equal parts hope and terror. Every combined ship within a dozen systems is going to know exactly where we are. Then we'd better make sure it only has to work once. Finishing the drive took everything they had. Sol worked in a fever of concentration that reminded Rourke of the woman he first met, weary and consumed and utterly alone even with him standing 3 feet away, except now the isolation was a choice about the work and not a wall built against him. He learned, in those final days of assembly, more about Vulpine engineering than he'd ever expected to know. That the spiraling patterns etched into every component weren't decoration but a kind of structural language, load paths and resonance channels made visible, a design philosophy that treated a ship's systems less like machinery and more like something grown, something with its own strange organic logic. "It's beautiful," he said, watching the final housing lock into place with a soft, chiming resonance that seemed to hum in his own chest. "I don't understand a tenth of what I'm looking at, but it's beautiful. My mother used to say a ship should feel like it wants to fly, not like it's being forced to." Sol ran a hand along the finished assembly, something tender and grieving in the gesture. "I think this is the first thing I've built since the massacre that actually does. Because you had a reason to finish it. Because I had you to finish it with." She said it plainly, without her usual armor of deflection, and the honesty of it landed somewhere in Rourke's chest with more force than the pirate ambush that had started this whole impossible journey. "I need to tell you something, before we do this. Before we activate it, and everything changes. Okay. When I climbed onto your ship, I told myself it was about the engine. About finally having a reason to leave, a purpose bigger than survival." Her tail curled close, an old, nervous habit he'd learned to read like a second language. That was true. But it wasn't the whole truth. "I climbed aboard because the thought of watching you fly away and going back to that workshop alone felt worse than every danger waiting for us out here. I didn't want to survive without you. I still don't." The confession hung in the cramped cargo bay, quiet and enormous, and Rourke closed the distance between them without a plan for what came next, only the certainty that 6 weeks of shared labor and 6 years of her solitude had led, somehow, unexpectedly, to this exact moment. "I wasn't going to say it first," he admitted, close enough now to feel the warmth radiating off her. "Because I thought you'd bolt out the nearest airlock if I did. But I've felt the same thing since about week 2. When you yelled at me for stripping a bolt wrong and I realized I liked being yelled at, as long as it was you doing it." "Week 2. She shook her head, something wondering in the gesture. "I built an entire wall around myself specifically so nothing could get through it in less than a decade, and you managed it in 14 days by stripping a bolt badly. I have many talents." "You have exactly one relevant talent, and it's apparently being irritating in a way I find endearing." But there was no bite in it, only warmth, and she reached up to trace the line of his jaw with a gentleness that undid something careful in his chest. "I spent 6 years telling myself that wanting anyone close was a weakness I couldn't afford. That every person who mattered to me was a person the Combine could use to hurt me, or a person I'd eventually have to watch disappear the way I watched everyone else disappear. It felt safer to want nothing. To need no one." Her thumb brushed once, softly, along his cheek. "You made that impossible about a month before either of us admitted it out loud. I'm not going anywhere, Sol. You don't know that. Neither of us knows that, not with a body in orbit somewhere that wants us both dead." Her voice caught, but she pushed through it, steady despite the tremor underneath. "That's what scares me most, if I'm honest. Not the warships. Not even losing another home. It's the thought of finally letting myself want something again and losing it anyway. Then we don't let that happen." He pulled her closer, close enough that he could feel her heartbeat against his own chest, quick and unsteady and entirely, achingly alive. "I can't promise you the galaxy won't try. I can promise you I'm not built to run from this the way I ran from every other complicated thing in my life before I crashed into your front yard. You're worth staying scared for, Sol. I decided that a while ago, too." Her laugh was startled out of her, bright and real, and when she kissed him it tasted like relief and terror in equal measure, the particular flavor of two people who'd both been braced for loss finding, instead, something worth staying for. "We should activate the drive," she murmured against his mouth, not moving away. "In a minute. Rourke, the Combine can wait 90 more seconds. I've earned it." She laughed again, and this time when she pulled back it was to look at him with an expression that held nothing guarded in it at all, just warmth, and hope, and the fragile, hard-won beginning of something neither of them had expected to survive long enough to feel. The drive activated with a sound Rourke would never forget for the rest of his life. Not the roar of conventional thrusters but something closer to a held breath finally released, a low, resonant hum that built through the Kestrel's death's hull like the ship itself was singing. Space didn't simply pass by the viewport. It folded, the stars smearing into long golden threads, the barrier between charted and uncharted space parting like a curtain drawn back by a hand that had been waiting 200 years for someone to pull it. "It's working," Sol breathed, hands steady on the controls despite the tremor Rourke could feel through the deck plating itself, the whole ship humming in sympathetic resonance with the ancient drive at its heart. "Rourke, it's actually—" The proximity alarm cut her off. Behind them, hyperlane space tore open, and this time it wasn't 4 black warships. It was 11, arrayed in a hunting formation that told Rourke everything he needed to know about how badly the Syndrome Combine wanted what was sitting in his cargo hold. "They followed the resonance," Sol said grimly. "I told you they would. How close are we to full transition?" 40 seconds. Maybe less. Then we hold them off for 40 seconds. Rourke's hands flew across the Kestrel's weapons controls, bringing what remained of her salvage defenses online, every instinct from a lifetime of dodging pirates in the Dresk belt narrowing down into the single, animal focus of survival. "Sol, whatever happens, keep that drive charging. Don't stop for me. I'm not leaving you to die for 40 seconds of thruster time. You're not going to have to." He banked hard, throwing the Kestrel into a spiraling burn that put the ship's newly reinforced hull between the pursuing warships and the delicate, glowing heart of the engine housing. Just fly. The next half-minute passed in a blur of weapons fire and shuddering impacts, the Kestrel's deck taking hits that would have gutted her before Sol's repairs, absorbing damage that her rebuilt plating, forged from alloys no modern shipyard could replicate. Shrugged off with a resilience that made Rourke understand, finally, exactly how much of herself Sol had poured into this ship's rebirth. The drive's hum built to a crescendo. The stars ahead didn't just smear now, they tore, a wound opening in the fabric of charted space, gold and impossible and vast. "Now!" Sol shouted, and Rourke threw every remaining scrap of power into the thrusters, aiming the Kestrel's deck straight into the widening breach as combined weapons fire chased them into the light. The universe went white, then gold, then nothing at all. When the light faded, the Kestrel's deck drifted in a sky Rourke had no name for. The stars here burned in colors he'd never seen from any charted system. Deep violets and soft, impossible greens, scattered across a void that felt older somehow than the space they'd left behind. And ahead of them, resolving slowly out of the strange starlight, hung a cluster of worlds untouched by corporate mining scars or industrial haze, verdant and quiet and achingly beautiful. "Sol!" His voice came out barely above a whisper. "Sol, look!" She was already looking, hands frozen over the controls, gold eyes wide and shining and wet in a way he'd never seen from her before, not even in her darkest confessions about the massacre. "That's—" Her voice broke entirely. "That's the signature. The resonance pattern. It's responding. Something out there is answering the drive." The combined warships hadn't followed them through the breach. Whatever gate the ancient engine had torn open had sealed the instant the Kestrel cleared it, leaving pursuit and threat and 6 years of hunted solitude on the other side of a boundary that no longer existed for them. A signal bloomed on the sensor display, gentle and inquisitive, unmistakably Vulpine in its structure. Then a second. Then a dozen more, resolving out of the strange gold-green light of this uncharted system into shapes Rourke recognized instinctively despite never having seen anything like them, ships built with the same organic, spiral-etched philosophy as the Kestrel's rebuilt engine, sleek and impossible and alive with the same warm resonance he'd felt humming through Sol's finished work. "They're real," Sol whispered, and the words came apart in her mouth, disbelief and grief and joy tangled together into something too large for language. Rourke, they're real. My mother wasn't lying. They're still here. A transmission crackled through, in the same looping language the pendant had spoken, and Sol answered it with a fluency that surprised even her, tears streaking unashamed through the orange fur of her cheeks as she spoke words Rourke didn't understand but recognized, somehow, as homecoming. The escort ships guided them down through the gold-green atmosphere of the largest world in the cluster, a planet Sol named, translating haltingly from the transmission, as something close to sanctuary that remembers. Rourke watched it resolve beneath them through the viewport. Terraced cities built into the sides of vast, forested valleys, structures grown rather than built in the same organic, spiral-etched style as the drive housing that had carried them here, rivers of pale silver water threading between them like veins of living metal. It's real, Sol kept saying, quietly, as though repetition might make the fact settle somewhere it could be trusted. It's real, it's... Her voice broke entirely on the third repetition, and Rourke reached over without a word and held her hand the rest of the way down, letting her have the silence to feel whatever needed feeling. They touched down in a wide landing terrace at the heart of the largest city, ringed by a crowd that had gathered with a speed that suggested word of their arrival had outraced the ship itself. Rourke had expected fear, or suspicion, or at best a wary, cautious welcome. What he got instead, the moment the Kestrel's ramp lowered and Sol stepped out into the gold-green light, was something closer to disbelief cracking open into raw, unrestrained joy, an elder woman near the front of the crowd crying out a name that wasn't Sol's, but that made Sol stumble to a halt, hand pressed to her own mouth, before she managed a single broken word in return. "Aunt," she breathed, and then she was running, and the crowd was parting, and Rourke stood alone at the top of the boarding ramp and watched a woman who'd spent 6 years believing herself the last of her family collapse into the arms of someone who very clearly was not a stranger at all. The colony that received them called itself Solen's Rest, named, Sol explained later, voice still thick with wonder. For an ancestor 5 generations removed, who had led the original contingency fleet through the same breach 2 centuries before, carrying with her the seed of everything her descendants had built in this hidden, untouched corner of the galaxy. They did not know, at first, what to make of the human who'd arrived at their gates alongside a daughter of the Ashenmark line they'd long assumed lost to whatever fate had befallen the greater colony beyond the barrier. Rourke stood in the strange gold-green light of an alien sun, surrounded by faces that watched him with the same wary calculation Sol had once turned on him in a rust-colored graveyard workshop, and understood, with a clarity that steadied something in his chest, that he was standing exactly where he was meant to be. The woman Sol had called Aunt Maren Ashenmark, it turned out, her mother's younger sister, sent to Solen's Rest as part of the original contingency fleet 2 centuries removed, kept alive far longer than should have been possible by systems of medicine Rourke didn't understand and didn't need to, sat with them long into the planet's slow, gold-lit evening, filling in the parts of the story Sol had never been able to piece together alone. "Your mother chose to stay behind," Maren said, her voice carrying the same measured cadence Rourke had come to recognize in Sol's own, softened now by age and old grief. "She believed the greater colony needed defending in place, that scattering everyone to the contingency would only delay the Combine, not stop them. She was wrong about that. But she wasn't wrong to hope someone would survive to find us anyway." Her gaze moved to Sol, warm and aching all at once. "I told myself for 6 years that hope was foolish. I am glad, more than I have words to say, to have been wrong about that too." Sol said little in response, her hand tight in Rourke's beneath the table, but the tears that slid unchecked down her face said everything her voice couldn't manage. It was 2 days later, at a gathering of the colony's elders in the terrace square below Maren's home, that the question Rourke had been waiting for finally came, relayed through Sol in the looping, musical language he still couldn't parse but had grown to love the sound of anyway. "They want to know why you came," Sol translated, standing close beside him, her hand finding his without hesitation, without the old, careful distance she'd once kept between herself and every stranger who wandered into her life. "Why a human risked everything to bring one of their lost back home." Rourke looked at the assembled crowd. Elders and children and everyone between, a whole civilization that had survived in secret, waiting patiently across 2 centuries for a homecoming they'd stopped daring to hope for, and then looked at Sol, at the woman who'd held a plasma cutter to his throat, and then rebuilt his ship, and then rebuilt something in him he hadn't known was broken. "Tell them," he said, "that I didn't do it because it was brave, or because I had nothing better to do. Tell them I did it because somewhere between a crashed ship and a graveyard moon, I found someone worth staying for. And I intend to keep staying, for as long as she'll have me." Sol translated it, voice unsteady, and the crowd's murmur shifted, wariness giving way, slowly, gradually, to something warmer, something that recognized in his words a truth their own history had taught them to value above almost anything else. That found family, chosen and fought for, was no lesser thing than family born. Months later, with the Kestrel's debt refitted in earnest at Solen's Rest's-owned shipyards, her hull reinforced with alloys grown rather than forged, her drive humming with a resonance that no longer needed to hide from anything, Rourke stood on the ship's boarding ramp and watched Sol argue cheerfully with a colony engineer twice her age about thruster calibration, gesturing with the same sharp, precise economy she'd once used to threaten his life. She caught him watching and crossed the yard to join him, tail flicking with the easy contentment he'd learned to recognize as uniquely hers, a peace that had been 6 long years in the making and was only now, finally, allowed to settle. "They want us to stay," she said. "Permanently. There's a place here, if we want it. A whole world of people who remember what my mother died protecting, and a workshop with better tools than I ever dreamed of building alone. Do you want to stay?" She considered the question with the same careful weight she gave everything that mattered. "I want to stay sometimes. And I want to leave sometimes too. There's a whole galaxy full of stranded pilots crashing into graveyards, Rourke. Somebody should be out there helping the next one who needs it." Her hand found his, fingers interlacing with an ease that still, some days, caught in his chest like wonder. "As long as I get to choose who I go with. I think that can be arranged." Behind them, the Kestrel's deck gleamed under an alien sun, rebuilt twice now, once from wreckage, once from purpose. Carrying inside her hull the blueprint for a future either of them could have imagined the day a battered salvage pilot stumbled, half dead, into a hidden workshop at the edge of a forgotten graveyard moon. Marin had offered, before they left, to send word back through the breach, a careful, coded signal that might one day reach whatever remained of charted space, letting the wider galaxy know that the Ashenmark line, and the colony that had sheltered its last survivors, still endured. Sol had refused, gently but firmly, and Rourke understood why without needing to ask. Some doors, once closed against people who'd done nothing but take, deserved to stay closed a while longer, until the ones on the other side of it had a say in when they opened again. "Someday," Sol had told her aunt, hands still linked with Rourke's own, "we'll go back. Not to hide anymore. To choose, on our own terms, who gets to know we're still here." Marin had accepted that with the same quiet grace she'd carried through 2 centuries of waiting, and pressed into Sol's palm a second pendant, twin to the one that had guided them home, etched with new coordinates neither of them had decoded yet. "For the next stranded pilot who needs somewhere to land," Marin had said, and Sol had laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind Rourke had only heard from her a handful of times since the graveyard moon, and folded her aunt into an embrace that lasted longer than either of them seemed willing to end. Now, standing on the boarding ramp with that new pendant warm in her coat pocket and an entire uncharted galaxy spread out beyond the ship's nose, Sol turned to look at him one more time, gold eyes bright with a certainty that had taken 6 long, lonely years to earn and, in the end, only 6 weeks to find again. "You ever think," she said, "about how none of this happens if you don't crash into my front yard?" "I think about it constantly. Mostly I think about how bad my landing must have looked from your workshop. Catastrophic." The ghost's smile had become, somewhere along the way, an easy, unguarded grin, and it was aimed at him now without a trace of the old wariness. "Genuinely one of the worst pieces of piloting I've ever witnessed. I nearly didn't bother coming to check if you'd survived." And yet here we are! And yet here we are! She stepped in close, resting her forehead against his the way she'd taken to doing in quiet moments neither of them announced or explained, just a small, private gesture that had become its own kind of language between them. For what it's worth, roared Calder, worst landing I've ever seen, best thing that's ever happened to me. In that order? I'll take it. Ahead of them, an entire uncharted galaxy, waiting to be found. Beside him, a mechanic who had once sworn never to leave her prison, and who had, in the end, chosen instead to build herself a home that could fly. They lifted off together, the engine singing its old, resonant song, and did not look back.